thanks very much for being here again today. Today, I want to talk about a group of Christians who rejected the cross of Christ. It was in the 10th century when a group of Christians developed who rejected the very famous and accepted Christian symbol of the cross, a symbol that had been with Christianity since the very beginnings, as far as we can tell. Why? Why would they do such a thing? Well, if you asked this group, why would they reject such a universally accepted symbol? In the words of one of their leaders, they would say this: if the king of your country were suddenly beaten to death by a piece of wood, would you take that piece of wood then and make it your national symbol and generate it? If a terrorist came in and shot your wife with a revolver, would you then wear the symbol of the revolver around your neck and be happy about it, venerating it? That's a modern example of the same thing. Well, that was their reasoning, and they rejected the use of the cross on their buildings or up on their person. This group was called the Bogomils, and they were named for their founding priest. And they had some other beliefs that were dualistic, adoptionist, and Gnostic in flavor. As far as their dualism, there was, in their belief, the good God who created the spiritual kingdom. And then there was the devil, or Satan, who created the material world and humans. Apparently, when the faith first began, they saw God as having two sons, Satan, the elder of the two, who rebelled against God and ended up on the earth, creating the earth and humanity. The younger son was Jesus, who then came to the earth, making it possible for humans to be restored to the Father. Well, later the belief became that God and Satan were two equal yet opposing forces of good and evil. Now, adoptionist means that they reject the doctrine of the incarnation, that Jesus was God come to earth, born of a virgin, but that he was adopted as God's son at the time of his baptism. And we see some other faiths believing that same thing. And then Gnostic, in that they see the material world as evil, opposed to the higher spiritual kingdom. And scholars believe that Bogomils have their roots in the Manichaean and the Paulician churches. Now, we've talked about Mani and the Manichaeans before, and we'll do the other group sometime in the future. Well, what else? Well, they valued the Lord's Prayer as a powerful weapon against the devil, against evil. And they performed rituals and had specific sayings and rituals against evil spirits. So there was an emphasis on overcoming evil spirits. Each community, each church community had its own 12 apostles, and women were much more equal in this sect and they could become among the elect. They also rejected baptism and the Eucharist and the whole organization of the Orthodox Church as it was at that time. It was very ritualistic, filled with pomp and circumstance and rituals and gold and power and money. They just rejected that whole system. In addition, they discouraged the functions of men, of humans, when they brought them in touch with the material world. So they discouraged marriage and the eating of meat. They were mostly vegetarian, and the drinking of wine. So we could say they were vegetarian teetotalers. They were extremely Puritan in style. And needless to say, the Orthodox Church declared their teachings and their practices as heretical, and they made efforts to bring them back into orthodoxy. So, what's their history? Well, the Bogomils began as a religious sect in the Baltics. It arose in Bulgaria in the middle of the 10th century. And during the 11th and 12th century, it spread over many European and Asian provinces of the Byzantine Empire. Actually, its growth into Constantinople resulted in about 1100 in the trial and the imprisonment of the prominent Bogomils in the city, and their leader, Basil, was burned alive at the stake. In the second half of the 12th century, it spread westward. By the early 13th century, the dualistic communities of Southern Europe, and scholars named them as the Paulicians and the Bogomils, and they were in the east, and in the west, the Cathars or the Cathari. They formed a network, a Gnostic network, stretching from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time on the Cathars in the future. In the 13th and the 14th centuries, Rome dispatched several legions and Franciscan missionaries to either convert or expel them from Bosnia. And many of those who were considered heretics in Bosnia were Bogomils. Now, a bit more, just an interesting sideline. When shortly after the middle of that same century, the 15th century, the Turks conquered Bosnia, the Bosnian Bogomils, in large numbers and apparently without a whole lot of persuasion, went over to Islam. It seems like the simple practices of that faith were more congenial to them than the ritual of the Orthodox Church. It's always interesting to try to trace the origins of these different sects, who they might have come from. And we see that this group seems to have been influenced by the Manichaeans and the Paulicians. And then their descendants were apparently the Cathars and the Albigenses that we'll also look at in the future. Seems that they traveled far and wide, became perhaps the most influential heresy in the Balkan area in the medieval times. everywhere they went, they rebelled against the organized and very powerful and rich church. And I think we see that not only then, but in modern times, and especially in the later days of the Protestant Reformation, people hoping to go back to a simpler, more natural, perhaps a more organic faith that they imagine existed in the beginnings of their religion. So, thank you once again for joining with me, and I hope you can be back next week. We'll look at another group. This was just a small peek into the Bogomils. Like many of the groups, what we get about them comes mostly from their enemies, and so we're not always sure how accurate some of it is, and we don't have very much of their actual writings or words. But this gave us a peek into their worldview and a look at the lifestyle that they chose during this medieval history in our world. I'll see you soon. Take care.